Oh boy, it's me here to talk about Warhammer and the Horus Heresy. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy and good and great? And really good. And oh my gosh, listen to all of the sounds of battle, the epic heroic struggle around me. But what if instead we just had something a little bit more calming? So hey, let's go ahead and start that like this. Ooh, rain sound effects, huh? You like that? I like that. It's very calming and good. It's washing away the stench of battle. Oh man, I just wanted to talk about the Horus Heresy for a minute because I was thinking back on it, and I watched the video from Arbiter Ian on the Horus Heresy, and I was thinking about it. I've read 44 books on the Horus Heresy. Some of them were real struggles to get through. Some of them were great. And part of the reason I want to talk about is I read a lot. I mostly read nonfiction and history stuff. I read a lot of stuff on like social theory and, you know, socialism and modern issues and things like that. I also read a lot of history stuff. I read a lot about religion, as you might guess, and all these sorts of things. And, you know, when it comes to fiction writing, I don't tend to do very long series. I like Discworld, and I like a lot of the Night Watch or the Guards series for, like, Discworld, and I like the Witches stuff. And I bounce around, read different things. Warhammer is one of the few fiction universes, like we were talking about Warhammer Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, or Warhammer 40k, where I delve in regularly. And sometimes it's just kind of the way that they write characters in this weird setting that really attracts me. But other times it's just like, it just feels like a nice lived-in world, like a world that you could really kind of know things about, and that's kind of interesting to me. Especially with Warhammer Fantasy more than anything. But I decided to read all these Horus Heresy books, partially for the other channel where I did that review of the overall Horus Heresy. And now that it's been a little bit of time since I've done that, I was kind of looking back, and you know what I realized is that there are these moments that are really, really nice. There's a lot of like little character moments that really liven up the whole thing and really show the strengths of certain writers and can really make it so that it's like, oh man, it's worth doing, like revisiting. And it makes it so that there are certain characters that you really come to like and certain characters that you really come to dislike. And you know, for instance, I really dislike Rogel Dorn, but I think that Vulcan is awesome, and I also think that, you know, Alfarius is like one of my favorites now. Well, Vulcan, Alfarius, and Lorgar are easily in my top 3. And then, you know, it kind of just depends. Like, Lorgar is just like this very interesting character because what I liked so much about it was that it wasn't just about the ultimate spaceman being ultimate spaceman. There are books of that in the Horus Heresy, and that's kind of a good chunk of it. There's a lot of like bolter porn, as they call it, where, you know, there's just like dudes running around shooting bolters at each other because, like, who gives a shit? I mean, yeah, Space Marines shoot bolters. Crazy. The character stuff is the much more interesting things to me. The things where you can see character development and see why characters are doing what they're doing, that's much cooler to me. And much more interesting because, like, what shapes these legions? What shapes their like ideas? And, you know, I also think it's kind of this interesting thing to like look at the ideas of masculinity that are represented in these. Like, what are they trying to achieve? What holds them back? You can see these ideas of like, oh, we're never allowed to have any weakness and we're never allowed to change, and how that like kind of breaks them internally and how it makes things so much more difficult for them. Whereas, you know, if Space Marines were allowed to have healthy relationships, I think a lot of this stuff probably wouldn't happen. And of course, you got to remember that a lot of these guys are like teenagers and stuff as this is going on, and it really hammers in how like screwed up the whole thing is. And that the Primarchs, you know, as intelligent as they are, you know, often act like petulant children. That's kind of, that's very interesting. And Lorgar has this thing about him where, like, you can see that in a lot of ways he's his own downfall, but he's also, like, he's right about a lot of things, and he makes sense. And then this character is kind of put in this, like, crazy, ridiculous setting, and it's like, okay, well, what would happen in this crazy, ridiculous setting if you put a character like this in there? It's like, oh, okay, this is interesting. That stuff is interesting. But when you start talking about, oh, man, everybody is, like, so cool and so heroic, and everybody's doing their best to shoot the other man, it's like, oh, man, who cares? Who could possibly care? It's just generic armored man versus generic armored man. And there's like so many extra characters and things like that just don't need to be there. There's not really any reason to have all these extra dudes other than to just have someone to write about. But I also really like how often it reminds us that these people are ultimately still human. Now, you will see that if you read a lot of those books, the standards and the, like, there's, like, little things where lore doesn't really make sense together. Like, Space Marines are all over the place in, like, how durable they are versus how, like, stoic they are. Do they feel fear or not? What do they feel exactly? Do people feel this, like, innate transhuman dread? Like, sometimes it's a huge thing, other times people don't feel that at all, etc. It's really weird. There's lots of, like, little stuff where I think part of that is just, of course, you don't have a single consistent vision. You have so many authors writing all these different things, and you can kind of see consistencies between books if they're, like, of the same author making sense. But if you go to like, between authors, sometimes it makes less sense. It's sort of like how Gilman at some points seems like a really interesting character, and then at other points just seems like such a pompous ass, and it just seems like they just made him weird at times, and then other times he's great. Like, I kind of got the like, in the first Heretic book, he just seems like an idiot, kind of an asshole for the things he does. But then, like, later on in other books, like No Fear and things like that, he acts very differently, and I almost get the impression that these are two different characters. And I kind of wonder if I do definitely think that the 66 or 67, I can't remember exactly, it's in the 60s, number of books they have is just too many. It was just way too many. I'm glad that they made money off of it, you know, that's good. I don't have any problem with that, but I do think that there's just way too many, and, like, characters can't truly be that consistent. And now, of course, you know, there's the whole thing of, like, people act differently depending on who they're interacting with, what's just happened in their life, excuse me, what they're going through at that very moment, all this other stuff. But you still want a little consistency. You still want people to feel like they mesh together and they make an interesting story. And I just feel like in snippets, these stories are great. If you look at, like, just a couple of books, there's some really good stories in there. You know, like, Vulcan Lives has some really good stories, and then there's stories like First Heretic. First Heretic is, like, this great portrayal of Lorgar, and you really see why he goes down the path he does. You can say it's a stupid reason or whatever, but you understand his mentality and what exactly he's going for. And you see, like, the development of that character as he progresses along this path until he kind of becomes, like, a mustache-twirling villain, because, you know, ultimately Lorgar is this kind of being that wants to give himself up to something greater, but the thing he decides to give himself up to are these, like, ultimate embodiments of, like, basically evil and chaotic, and this chaotic nature. So that's what he ends up doing, and that's why you see him progress down this path and, like, see what he becomes. And ultimately, like, you know, he's like all about Horus until, you know, one of those later books, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, Horus is too weak and I have to seize power. It's like, that's a very chaos mindset to have. Like, and it's interesting to see that development. I didn't necessarily love it the first time I read it, but, you know, looking back on it now, I think it's actually pretty good. And, you know, seeing the development of Horus and why he falls to chaos is very interesting. It's like this overarching character thing where, like, you see him throughout these books and, like, the little changes that are made, and, like, how he almost seems to be fighting against himself and his own nature at times to try and do this thing that on some level he seems to recognize is not doing great. I mean, they're killing a lot of people. And ultimately, like, the hypocrisy of it, like, oh, look what you would make the Imperium, Father, but, like, look what I'm making the Imperium. Now, I also think it's very interesting because I think it really hammers home the idea that the Imperium was never a great place. You read some of these books, is it Nemesis? It might be Nemesis. But there's a book where, like, most of it takes place in, like, on Terra, and you see that in the shadow of the Golden Throne, everything is, like, going terribly, and that people are, like, living in ghettos, and people are not, like, well taken care of. And, like, this is in the shadow of the Golden Throne. This is, like, on your home world, and the Emperor doesn't care. He's all about, this has to be my way, and it has to be now. And you really get, I think, a good idea of, like, kind of why the Emperor doesn't work as an idea. And there's all this, like, there's a lot of, like, those anti-totalitarian things going on. I think the Emperor also suffers from a little bit of that, like, multiple personality type thing because of so many different people trying to write him. Where sometimes they try to write him more sympathetic, and other times he's just clearly not that sympathetic. I think even the ones that try to make him sympathetic actually kind of do a bad job. It becomes pretty evident that the Emperor doesn't really care about his individual citizens. What he cares about is his way or the highway. He's like, I'm saving the species, but of course, you know, he's like a megalomaniac. He thinks that he's the only way to save the species, when, if you really get down to it, ultimately in 40k, he's the ultimate damnation of the species, in a way. He makes everything worse. He is the authoritarian might that makes all of the Imperium possible. He is this figurehead that now is uniting the Imperium in this thing that he didn't want it to be. But ultimately, he's still responsible for so much of this because of what he has done. You know, sacrificing billions and trillions of lives for his own vision of progress is ultimately, you know, the most heinous crime of all. It's like, it's kind of interesting to see people who, like, really defend the Emperor, because the Emperor is basically mega Hitler. But, like, you know, less racist, which is good. I mean, I would prefer less racist. However, the numbers are still really bad. And, you know, of course, he's less racist towards humans. He's very racist towards Xenos. And you could say that, like, he talks about, like, all these ideas of, like, his dream for mankind, but his dream for mankind is ultimately this very flawed, fragile thing that you can kind of see that it's just like the vision of someone who can't get over themselves and can't get outside of their own head to see why their vision doesn't really make any sense. And after a while, you know, you get this idea that, like, betrayal was inevitable, and, like, maybe 40k was just inevitable because of the Imperium that the Emperor set up. And that's really interesting to me. It's also really cool because, for instance, when the Interrex first encounter Horus Lupercal and his Space Marines, they're like, oh, we thought you were servants of chaos because, like, well, look at you. And of course, you know, we as readers would be like, well, you know, that makes a lot of sense. Like, if you didn't know if you didn't know about Chaos Space Marines, you would probably look at an Imperial Space Marine with all their skulls and all their crazy obsession with war and stuff like that and be like, ah, yes, this is like a servant of chaos. You know what I mean? And I think that's very interesting. It's very interesting to see all these different things. And that's part of what I like about the Horus Heresy. However, I would still really not recommend the vast majority of the Horus Heresy books. They have these good moments sprinkled throughout, but man, there's just like so much bolter porn, just so much just random just shooting that it just feels so irrelevant. It's like, I just don't care. Like, look, man, you can write a Space Marine to be the best boy who has ever been bested boy forever, and it's just like, who cares? Now, ultimately, I would also say that if you really like that stuff, that's great, and I'm glad you enjoy it. But for me personally, it's just such a wash, like this rain washing away our sins. But yeah, I mean, and that's not to say that every battle is awful, but like after a while, it was just like, oh, character development, that's pretty interesting, and then nope, battle now. Does this battle have any purpose other than we went too long without showing guys shooting things? No? Cool. It's like, no, that's not as interesting to me as like the character development and things like that. And and there's some really great characters in the Horus Heresy, but there's also a lot of just chaff and just like, it feels like they tried a little too hard to just throw in extra stuff. I also just personally think that Space Marines, Loyalists, are probably one of the most boring factions in 40k. They're not the worst, and I do have my own chapter, the Rift Drakes, which I really enjoyed making. But there is a lot of stuff where it's just kind of like, man, big man in power armor can only take you so far. But at the same time, hey man, if you really enjoy it, that's great. I personally think Ferrus Manus, for instance, is really boring. But people seem to love him. Then there are definitely some good books, and I think I might like try to come up with a list of like books that I think are worth checking out. Anyway, I just wanted to share some thoughts because that's what I was thinking about lately. I hope that you all have a great day, and I hope that you enjoy whatever you're reading. And hey, if there's books you want me to check out, you can leave it in the comments or whatever. And like and subscribe, all that. All YouTube pleasantries. Thanks so much for stopping by and listening to my ramble. I hope you have a great one. I hope you know that I love you and God loves you. And bye-bye. Love you. Bye. Have a great fun time. Bye.